To be here today to welcome you to this great event, the Jewish week of Buffalo Week of Jewish Learning, which it's great to have it again. A few years ago, this program began with just one day, but now, as you can see, we have a full week of bringing together the university, the Jewish community, to amazing events. So I just want to quickly kind of go through the list of all the stuff that's happening. Number one, we have today the role of unity in Judaism with Rabbi Greenberg. He'll give a great talk on, you'll see in a minute, about very exciting things, which he'll explain as part of his annual lecture series that he's done for the last few years. Number two, tomorrow night, there's going to be a program called The Status of the Forgotten, Plato, the Babylonian Temple, and Beyond. Number three, on Tuesday, March 5th at 12:30 on campus for the Forbidden Fruit became an apple interpretation, iconography, is that right? Iconography? and linguistics. And then on Wednesday at 1 to 2 p.m., Pioneering Excellence, a spotlight of the Israel startup scene. And then on Thursday, Inclusive Design in a Jewish Context. Those last two programs, I believe, are on Zoom. But I just want to explain, I know Professor Green will come up as well. This Town and Gown partnership is a great addition to our community, and it could never have been done without the support, of course, of the Federation and Hillel, but the University of Buffalo, and specifically the great work that's done by Professor Alex Green. I want to take a moment to thank Alex on the great things that he's done for our community, but also for this amazing event, and you'll see this over the course of the week. I am personally looking forward to hearing some great talks and learning a lot, which is exactly the point of the program, and also listening to some great music down here. But I'm very much looking forward to it. So I guess I'll do the introduction for Rabbi Greenberg. Without any ado, I would like to welcome, of course, Rabbi Greenberg. This is his place, but to be our memorial for his lecture and learn a lot from you, which I always do when I come here on Shabbos. Take care, Rabbi. Thank you.
I'm going to, before we start, since we're going to be talking about unity, it makes sense to play some music, a song about unity. Max Zellickman, take it away.
No, excuse me, not a lot.
And who are you? Oh, it's my son, Rabbi Yeshua Greenberg.
And I hope you too, because I hope you know this too. Loner alle inim.
Loner alle Mashiach mekabel ponim zayin, Mashiach mekabel ponim zayin. Lo mira leineinem, lo mira leineinem, Amidst levayin. Lo mira leineinem, lo mira leineinem, Amidst
I'd like to welcome everyone.
I want to know what that song means.
What does the song mean? We're all going to gather together to greet Mashiach. Let us take a little bit of wine. That's the gist of it. It's about joining together in unity. First of all, welcome everybody for coming. It's a pleasure to have you here, and hope that you can make it for other classes as well. Next week will be a lecture on Purim, why it's not a minor holiday. It's going to be here at 11 o'clock. And today's class I want to dedicate to the Jews living in Israel, in particular, to the liberation of the hostages and the well-being of all the soldiers, and for a complete victory over the forces of evil. And we pray and hope that this will lead us to true unity, and the ultimate goal is, of course, the coming of Mashiach. The situation in Israel since October 7th created a whole atmosphere of unity that I think is unprecedented. Even though after the 6-Day War, we had tremendous unity as well. I think there's something different about the unity today, precisely because it came after the greatest amount of disunity in Israel in particular. There was such discord, such conflict, demonstrations, pro and con. And then afterwards, after October 7th, the Jews in Israel came together, as well as Jews throughout the entire world. And when unity comes after division, it's greater than unity without the division. King Solomon essentially said that when he said that I see there's an advantage to wisdom over foolishness as the advantage of light over darkness. Now, you don't have to be King Solomon to know that light is better than darkness. Hasidic texts explain that he meant by that when light comes out of darkness, light is preceded by darkness, the light is much greater than light when it is not preceded by darkness. So October 7th introduced us into a world of Jewish unity after there was darkness and a lot of disunity. Jews are the most divisive people in the world. And they're the most united people in the world. That's the enigma of being Jewish. If you ever go into a yeshiva, rabbinical students, they're arguing nonstop, the top of their lungs. You think that each one wants to rip the other one to pieces. And this is true by extension throughout the world. Jews have always been arguing, and sometimes the arguments become very, very ugly. But at the same time, we're also the most united people in the world. I just want to share a story. It may be apocryphal, but they don't tell these stories about other people. That's a sign that it's a story that could be true. That say during World War I, we know there were Jews on both sides of the war. And the story is told that in one battle, a very fierce battle, everyone was wiped out except for one soldier on each side. And then they exhausted all their bullets. And then they're fighting with their bayonets, and one of them threw the other one to the ground and was ready to kill him. And the one that was on the ground was a Jew. And what does a Jew do before he dies? He cries out, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And when the one who was about to kill him hears it's a Jew, he dropped his bayonet, he grabbed the other soldier, he picks him up and embraces him. And the way I heard the story is that they both left Europe. They immigrated to Toronto, and they started families, and one had a son and one had a daughter, and the son of one married the daughter of the other. That's the story they tell. But it's the story is illustrative of how Jews can be fighting fiercely, and yet there's such a unity that pervades their existence. There's another cute story that is told about, in the olden days, there was a paritz, the landowner, the squire, would meet with his fellow squires, and they would like to find new ways of entertaining themselves. So one time they decided each one is going to go back home and find some ferocious animal, and the two animals are going to fight. Now, one of them goes home and he looks for a ferocious animal. There were no real ferocious animals there, so he calls in his Jewish manager, called him Mushka, and he says to Mushka, you know what, I have a job for you. You're going to be dressed like a bear, and you're going to be involved in this fight with some wild animal. Well, of course, Mushka couldn't say no, and the fight is about to begin. They let the bear out, and the other side lets a lion out, and as the lion approaches, Mushka starts to cry out Shema Yisrael, the same Shema Yisrael. And the other ferocious animal answers, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchus Olam V'Ed. It's a metaphor that, yes, we look very different. There are substantial differences between us. One Jew is totally different from the other. But beneath the veneer, there's Shema Yisrael and Baruch Shem. Those are the stories that illustrate this point of how we can be so different and yet we're so much the same. Every Jewish holiday has a theme of unity in it. In fact, you can find the theme of unity in almost every aspect of Judaism. I'm going to focus a little bit on the month in which we are now situated, the month of Adar, the month in which we celebrate Purim, the defeat of Haman, who tried to annihilate the Jewish people. What was Haman's argument to the king Achashverosh? Why should we annihilate the Jews? So he starts off by saying, Yeshno Am Echad. There is one nation, and this nation is mefuzar and meforad, bein ha'amim, is scattered throughout the nations. And according to one interpretation, there are many interpretations of what he meant by that, but one interpretation is the Jews are such a discordant people, such a divisive people. They're scattered all over, they're fragmented, they don't get along with one another. And why should we keep such a nation alive? Haman's objective was to point out how Jews are not united. So what do we do in the month of Adar? We celebrate Purim. And Purim repudiates Haman's claim in several ways. Number one, it's customary before Purim to give a half shekel, a coin, a $50 if you're in America, to remind us of the half shekel the Jews had to give when they built the tabernacle in the desert. And subsequently, every year, Jews would have to give a half shekel. If you were rich, you gave no more than a half. If you were poor, no less than a half. What is the symbolism of the half shekel? Unity, that you're only half. You cannot be a whole without the other person. And that's the theme that we emphasize in Purim. And there's a midrash that says, the Talmud says that when Haman offered to give the king, Achashverosh, 10,000 silver talents, God laughed at him and says, the half shekel that the Jews have given canceled, neutralized your 10,000 silver talent. What does that mean? Your argument is the Jews are divisive. The Jews are a fragmented people. This will demonstrate, the half shekel the Jews have been giving will demonstrate that Jews are a united people. That's one aspect of it. Then in Purim we have a law that we're supposed to exchange gifts. We're supposed to give gifts, mishloach manos, 2 gifts to at least one person, and also matanos lavyonim, we're supposed to give gifts to the poor, at least to 2 poor people. Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz, the famous author of the Chodot, who lived about 500 years ago in Israel, in his work, in his commentary on the Megillah, on the Scroll of Esther, explains that requirement of Purim was designed specifically to repudiate Haman's argument that Jews are a divisive people. Look what we are. We're exchanging gifts with one another. We're thinking about the poor. So that's another aspect of how Purim and the month of Adar in general recognizes the importance of Jewish unity. But there's also another aspect of it. The Talmud tells us that Purim was really a reenactment of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. When the Jews received the Torah at Mount Sinai, the Talmud says we were compelled, we were coerced into it. God took the mountain, Mount Sinai, and he put it over the heads of the Jewish people, and he says, if you accept the Torah, fine, otherwise I will drop the mountain. Hasidic thought explains that this doesn't mean literally that God was threatening to destroy the entire Jewish people, but rather God smothered them with such love, with such attention by performing the great miracles of the Exodus, that how could they say no? So when they got the Torah at Mount Sinai, the Torah was given to them, but was imposed upon them. They couldn't refuse. When did the Jews really accept the Torah? Fully in the story of Purim, when God was hiding his face. He was not showering them with love. And in spite of all that, they didn't abandon their belief in one God and their commitment to the teachings of Judaism. Now, we find that in Mount Sinai, when the Jews came to Mount Sinai, the Torah describes their coming there in the singular, Vayichan Yisrael, and the Israelites encamped. And in Hebrew, the way it's expressed is in the singular. And Rashi explains why in the singular. It should have said, as it does with all other situations, Vayachanu, and they encamped. Why? And he encamped. And Rashi explains, because when they came to Mount Sinai, they were Ish Echad, they were like one person, Belev Echad, with one heart. They were totally united. We find the exact same thing with regard to the story of Purim. When the Megillah talks about the aftermath of the miracle of Purim, it says V'kibel, and he, singular, accepted. That the Jews accepted the Torah, and it uses the singular because the people were totally united. Now what's interesting, that we find almost the same thing with regard to the Egyptians. When the Egyptians were pursuing the Jews, the Torah uses the singular, noseah. he was riding to attack the Jews. So Rashi says the same thing. They were all belev echad, with one heart, ki ish echad, like one person. They were totally united in their desire to catch the Jewish people and enslave them or destroy them. But there's a significant difference. When it comes to the accepting of the Torah, it says they were like one person with one heart. Egypt, it says, was like one heart, like one person. What's the difference? So the Rebbe, in one of his discourses, explains the difference is significant. When the Egyptians were pursuing us, their unity was only a functional unity. They were not united. The one thing united them was their heart, their desire, the desire to catch the Jews and enslave them. And that's what unified them. Whereas at Mount Sinai, what unified the Jews, they were united because they were united. They were intrinsically, inherently united, and that translated into having the same aspirations as well. We're living in a time when the unity that we now created was created because of what was done to us. So all Jews from all stripes share. I say all Jews, if only all Jews. Unfortunately, it's not all Jews, but a significant amount that's unprecedented, I think, join with one another in recognizing the threat to our existence, and we're all united in trying to fight anti-Semitism wherever it shows wherever it rears its ugly head, and supporting Israel in doing what it has to do to get rid of the threat of Hamas. That's belev echad. That's one aspiration that unites us. The challenge for us is to go beyond that. We should be ki ish echad. We should be like one person, not just because we have one interest, common interest, but because we are really one. We are truly one. It's not a slogan. It's a reality. And that's what I want to explain today, what exactly that reality is based on, that we are one, truly one person. Talking about holidays, if there's any holiday that has the theme of unity pronounced, extremely emphasized, it's the holiday of Sukkot or Sukkot, depending on how you want to pronounce it, the Ashkenazic or Sephardic way. But either way, it's the same unity. The Talmud says, well, what do we do on Sukkot? We do two things, among other things. One is to dwell in a sukkah. A sukkah is a structure that encompasses us, that envelops us. And then we take the four species, the four plants, the etrog, the lemon-like fruit, the lulav, the palm branch, the hadassim, the myrtles, and aravos, the willows. And we put them all together and we recite a blessing. All of these rituals represent the idea of unity, but introduces us to different levels, different tiers of unity. Let's take the sukkah first. The sukkah envelops everyone. The Talmud says all of Israel theoretically could dwell in one sukkah. You don't have to have your own sukkah. Everyone could fit into one sukkah. What does that tell us? That tells us that no matter who we are, no matter how different we are from one another, we could fit into one sukkah. There's one overarching structure that unites all of us. How does that happen? How could that unite us? So there's a mystical explanation for it, and that translates even in the physical reality as well. The mystical explanation is, everyone is familiar with the song, Oseh Shalom Bimromav. What does that mean? People say it and they don't even realize what they're saying. God makes peace in the heavens. So should he make peace between us down here. What kind of peace is there in the heavens? Are the angels having pillow fights? And the answer is yes. Not quite pillow fights, but we have an angel called Michael. He's the angel of love, of kindness. We have another angel called Gavriel. Gavriel comes from the word gvura, strength, might, power, discipline. They're opposites. One is called water. Michael is water, the minister of water, and Gavriel is the minister of fire. Fire and water are not normal friends. They don't get along very well. But when God shines his light on them, their differences fade away, and fire and water could merge and unite and coexist. When you're in the presence of something much greater than yourself, then all your differences fade away. You don't see the differences between you. You see that which unites you. That's what the Sukkah represents, the overarching structure that reveals this higher recognition of God. The Sukkah, it says, is in order leman das, in order we should know. That the whole idea is the knowledge of God. When you're permeated with this knowledge of God, and that enters your consciousness in a very strong way, all the differences between people evaporate. But then, we're not always in a sukkah. We're not always capable of experiencing that transcendent spiritual force. That's why we need the four species. But before we get to the four species, this translates in the anti-Semites. The anti-Semites are onto something. We shouldn't just dismiss what they say and saying, well, this is just hatred. They're taking true ideas and perverting them. What is the true idea? That we are really one people. In fact, Haman, when he accuses the Jews of being scattered and fragmented, he starts by saying, Yesh no am echad, there is one nation. He recognized that they are one nation, paradoxically, and they're fragmented. How could you be one, united, and fragmented at the same time? Welcome to the Jewish people. That's the reality. I once had an experience. I was teaching at UB and was talking about the Holocaust. And one of the lessons of the Holocaust was that the Nazis didn't distinguish between a religious Jew, a secular Jew, a rich Jew, a poor Jew. All Jews were the same. And the Jews are really one people. And there was a Japanese woman who was auditing the class. Apparently her husband was a visiting professor. And she was listening very carefully, and she raised her hand. He says, isn't it true that whenever there's a crisis in the Jewish community, there's a certain button that Jews push, and all the Jews get together? I started laughing. I thought she was joking. And she's serious. I said, are you serious? Yes, that's what she said. I said, if only we had that button. I would love, unfortunately, we do have that button. That button was October 7th. And tragically, I would rather have other buttons that would bring about the same result. But that was the button that brings all the Jews together, and all of our differences evaporate. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, when he was in Warsaw, as the bombs were falling, there was one point where the bomb fell right next to them, and everyone cried out, Shema Yisrael. He says there were Jews there who were atheists. There were Jews there who were anti-religious. There were Hasidic Jews. There were assimilated Jews. There was every brand of Jew, and all of them, without consulting with one another, cried out Shema Yisrael. That's the essence of the Jew, and the anti-Semite recognizes that and uses it in a negative way. That's the Sukkah unity, that all Jews are part of one entity, of one existence. But then we have the differences. The Midrash, there's a very famous Midrash that says that the four species represent four classes of Jews, and how they have to all be united together. They don't lose their identities, but they're still united. What are the four classes that are represented by the four species? The Etrog, or Etrog, has taste and fragrance. Taste, the Midrash says, is symbolic of intellect. Because in Hebrew, the word for reason and the word for taste is the same, tam. So the fact that the Etrog has a good taste means it represents the Jew who is steeped in learning and intellectual. Fragrance is a metaphor for good deeds. When a person does good things, that person's reputation spreads far and wide, like the fragrance that wafts and spreads. So the Etrog represents the ideal Jew who has both intellectual capabilities, great scholar, and at the same time someone who is devoted to doing good and helping others. That's the ideal Jew. Then there's the lulav. The lulav is a date palm. Dates have taste. Dates are the most tasty foods. In fact, when the Torah says that Israel is a land of milk and honey, honey is referring to date honey. That's the sweetest fruit that there is. So the lulav represents taste, knowledge, intellect, but it doesn't have any fragrance. Someone who is in an ivory tower, someone who's devoted his life to learning, but doesn't have the time or the opportunity to do much good for others, doesn't make him a bad person, but nevertheless, he only has one of those qualities. Then you have the myrtles. The myrtles, hadassim, have fragrance when they're fresh, but there's no taste associated with the myrtles. That refers to the Jew who was steeped in good deeds, has good fragrance, but doesn't have the knowledge. The poor willows, the aravot, are representative of the Jew who has neither taste, neither knowledge, or good deeds. Simple person, because that's true about the willow. The willow has no taste and it has no fragrance. And what is the mitzvah? What is the obligation of the day? Is to take all these 4 plants, bind them, and join them together. That the Jews, in spite of their differences, have to all recognize that they have to be combined together. They don't lose their individuality, but they're still united. In order to understand what is real unity, the 4 species actually represent 4 different levels of unity. There's the unity created by the willow, the myrtle, the lulav, and the etrog. If you think about it, each one of these species represents unity. The 4th Lubavitcher Rebbe, known as the Rebbe Maharash, in one of his discourses, emphasizes how each one of these 4 species, not just putting them all together, but each one individually has the characteristic of unity. Let's take the willows. The willows in Aramaic are called achvana, which means brothers. The willows are brothers. They grow together. They grow in clusters. They're separate, totally separate, but they grow together. That's the kind of unity that the Jewish people experience because we live together. Especially in Europe, Jews were all put in ghettos by not necessarily imposed on them. Sometimes it was by choice. Jews lived together physically, geographically, through much of Jewish history, and that's what creates a certain sense of bonding and kinship between them. But then it goes beyond that. It's the mutual interest that we all have. The fact that we need to defend ourselves against the threats, we get together, we coalesce. We're separate entities, each one has his own philosophy, each one has his own style of life, but we recognize we have common interests, so we get together and we coalesce. That's the weakest form of unity. Then we have the hadassim, the three myrtle leaves, branches that we put attached to the lulav. Now, according to halacha, according to Jewish law, those 3 myrtles each one has to have 3 leaves coming out of one stem. So if you have 2 leaves coming out of one stem, and beneath it is another leaf coming out of another stem, it's not kosher. It has to be 3 out of one stem. What does that represent in terms of unity? Recognizing that though we are different, we all have one common source. We are all descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, the 3 patriarchs and 4 matriarchs. We are all descendants of those patriarchs and matriarchs. And what does it mean we're descendants? I mean, we're descendants of millions of other people. What's so special about the biological DNA is no longer effective in defining who we are physically, biologically. But there's a spiritual concept of DNA. Spiritual DNA of the patriarchs and matriarchs were bequeathed to all of their descendants, to all of their Jewish descendants. We all have the DNA, the spiritual DNA of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All of us have one common source. There was once a philanthropist, a very prominent member of the Jewish community, a leader in the Jewish community, who came to the Rebbe, and he very, very proud of his accomplishment, and he says to the Rebbe, I just organized a service, I think it was for Rosh Hashanah, for Jews who have no background. And the Rebbe looked at him and says, there's no such thing as a Jew without any background. Every Jew has a background. Every Jew is a descendant and inherits the traits of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But then we branch out and we separate. But when we recognize that we all have one common source, that's a deeper level of unity, because it represents our common source that unites us all. Then we have the lulav. The lulav, the palm branch, if you ever look at a palm tree, you see how the leaves spread out. That's not kosher. There has to be, all the leaves have to be bound together naturally. That means that they're not just three coming from one source, but there's a certain thing that binds them. There's a glue that binds them together. What is the glue that binds all the Jews together? It's the Judaism, it's Torah, it's the Mitzvot, the commandments. The Talmud says, he has an expression, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh B'Zeh. All of Israel are responsible for one another. That means if I see a Jew who is unaware of what it means to be a Jew, I can't say it's none of my business. Let the Jew discover Judaism on his own or her own. No, every Jew is responsible for every other Jew. And this manifests itself in many different ways in practical terms. And the Hebrew word for responsible, arevim, also has two other translations. Arevim could come from the word, it means mixed up. We're all mixed together. And it also has a translation of sweet. We are all sweet to one another, if only that was true. But in potential, we're all sweet to one another. That's our natural dispensation. And what brings that sweetness, what brings that unity, what's the glue that brings us all together? It's the fact that we are all committed in one way, consciously or subconsciously, to observing all the commandments. And that's the much more powerful unity than just having one common source or having shared interests. That's the unity that comes from a divine power. The mitzvah is a divine power. The word mitzvah, as I mentioned so many times, doesn't mean good deed. It means commandment, but it also means attachment. The mitzvah attaches us to God, but it also attaches us to every other Jew. When a Jewish woman lights the Shabbat candles, for example, before the onset of Shabbat, she is not just doing her mitzvah and connecting herself with God. What she is doing is connecting herself to every other Jewish woman in the world who's lighting a Shabbat candle today and everyone in the past who has done so. This is the greatest form of unity. There's no greater bond, because only a divine type of glue could accomplish that kind of bond. Then we get to the fourth level, the deepest level of unity, the Etrog. The Etrog, the Talmud says, has a unique characteristic, that it can stay on the tree through all 4 seasons. Not only does it not get hurt by virtue of some of the seasons, like winter, but it thrives. Each season contributes something that makes the Etrog stronger than if it had not been going through that season. When you look at an Etrog, could you see the difference between, you say, oh, this is the winter part, this is the summer part. No, because all the differences of all the seasons, not only are they all capable of contributing to the well-being of the Etrog, they are actually part and parcel of the Etrog. They unite with the Etrog in an organic way that you can't even separate. That's the deepest level of unity, where all Jews are connected. And what connects all Jews? What is it? But besides, of course, I said Judaism, Torah, Mitzvot, but there's something even deeper than that. And this requires a little bit of an introduction. We all know that we all possess a soul. What is the definition of a soul? This is a long lecture, but I'll just try to sum it up in a half a minute. A soul is the divine energy that God gives a person to enable them to fulfill their mission. Every human being was put in this earth with a mission. Every human being, without exception. And in order to fulfill that mission, you have to have divine energy. And the divine energy that you are given is commensurate with your specific mission, with your general mission and with your specific mission. When someone talks about a Jewish soul, what does that mean? It means that the Jewish people were singled out from other nations of the world who also have a divine mission to fulfill, to make the world a civilized world, Tikkun Olam, which is a universal mandate, not just for Jews, to make the world a perfected, repaired world. That's the mandate of every human being. The Jewish people were given an additional responsibility to make the world a godly world, to bring the divine in the world through observing all of the commandments. In order for us to fulfill that and to be a light to the nations, we have to have a unique resource the soul that we are given enables us to fulfill our mission. We all share that soul. So what binds us is not just we have a common ancestor, with all of which that entails. It's not just that we have a glue that binds us together. We all share one spiritual identity, and that's represented by the Etrog. Those are the 4 different levels. So to summarize, the Sukkah represents the overarching spirituality that makes all of us one, with total disregard for our differences. Our differences don't exist. Then we get into the level where our differences do exist. But nevertheless, we have the Willow, where our shared interests bring us together. We're like brothers. We have shared interests. Beyond that, beyond the shared interests, we have a common source. Beyond that, we have the mitzvahs that bind us together. And beyond that is the special soul that we have that unifies all of the Jewish people into one entity. We're one big esrog. Everyone knows, well, almost everyone knows the story of Hillel and Shammai. Hillel and Shammai were the 2 greatest sages of their time. Hillel lived 100 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, and Shammai was his colleague. But they were very different in personality. The Talmud tells the famous story of this potential convert who comes to Shammai, says, I want you to convert me to Judaism, but on the condition that you teach me the entire Torah on 1 foot. And what did Shammai do? He took a measuring rod and he chased him out. Had no patience with this guy. So he comes to Hillel, and Hillel says, sure, I'll convert you. You want to hear the whole Torah standing on 1 foot? The whole Torah is what is hateful to you, don't do to your fellow. The rest is commentary. Now go out and learn the rest. And he converted him. People sometimes misunderstand what their argument was about. Hillel and Shammai were the greatest scholars of their time. They were not just petty individuals who just did things by whim. So what exactly was Shammai saying, and what was Hillel saying? So everyone will be surprised to learn that there's a statement in Ethics of the Fathers that says you should accept every person, greet every person with a cheerful countenance. Who is the author of that statement? Shammai, not Hillel. Now you would expect Hillel to say that, but it's the Shammai who says that. So one explanation the Rabbi gives is that after he heard Hillel say what he said, Shammai says, you know what? I'll go along with him as well. He changed his attitude. But there's another way of explaining it as well. Shammai was not someone who looked down at other people. And if you look at the language that the Ethics of the Father uses, what it says over there is, I'm going to say it in Hebrew first, Havei mikabel et kol ha'adam b'sever panim yafot. If you translate it literally, it's not saying greet everyone, but it means greet the whole person cheerfully. There's a very big difference between those 2 translations. They're both accurate translations. When it says greet everyone cheerfully, it means everyone. But Shammai is saying, why do you greet everyone cheerfully? Because you greet the entire person. When you see a person with a fault, see a person with some type of deficiency, you sometimes look at that person and say, that's what defines that person. And you judge the person unfavorably. But when you judge the entire person, you welcome the entire person. The entire person is more than just the sum total of their faults and their qualities. When you look at a person, Shammai says, I look at the entire person. I don't look at particular activities or practices or beliefs of a person. Yes, sometimes a person has negative beliefs, negative actions. But I don't look at that. I look at the entire person. And that way I can greet everyone with a cheerful countenance. So why did he throw the guy out? because he couldn't tolerate the fact that this person was putting Judaism down, as if Judaism was such an empty religion, you can teach all of it on standing on one foot. That's why he took a ruler, a measuring rod. He's saying you don't measure. Your behavior doesn't measure to the standards of Judaism. But it's not as if he didn't recognize that this person had some value. So Shammai was on a very high level of acceptance of everyone, but he couldn't tolerate someone who was discrediting Judaism. Sometimes you have to recognize that you have to speak out when someone does something, even though you love the person, you love your child, but when the child misbehaves, you tell the child that what the child did was wrong. You don't allow the child, if the child does something really naughty, and you just go over and hug the child, that's going to be a bad message. You have to first tell the child what you did was wrong and then hug him. But you can't hug the person after doing something wrong. That was Shammai's attitude. Hillel had a deeper attitude. Hillel agreed with Shammai that you're not supposed to tolerate when people do things that are disrespectful or wrong. In fact, if you read Hillel's words in the same Ethics of the Fathers, what does Hillel say? You have to be a student of Aaron, love peace, pursue peace. And then he says you have to bring everyone close to Torah. He doesn't say bring Torah close to them, which would mean that you have to compromise the Torah to satisfy the needs of people who are not willing to really learn what Torah has to say about life. You have to bring them up to the level where they appreciate the Torah. Hillel recognized you can't just compromise things out of love. So then why did Hillel accept this convert? Because Hillel had a different approach. He agreed with Shammai, number one, that you have to judge the whole person. But then the person said something disrespectful. The person said something that was very negative, that Judaism is worthless. It's only like you can teach it on standing on one foot. I remember in the early 70s, there was a great movement of Jews into cults. And there was one Jewish young man who was into a cult, and his roommate tried to get him out of it, and he asked me if I can help. And I remember vividly, I'm walking with him in the Norton Union. Some of you are old enough to remember that structure. And I'm saying to him, it's a shame that he went into this cult. There's so much in Judaism. And you know what the student said to me? No, Judaism has nothing. Judaism is an empty religion, has nothing. And that was such a painful thing to hear a Jew saying that. And I don't blame him for it, because he said it out of ignorance. He wasn't exposed to it. But you can't just say, oh, it's very nice. So Hillel was certainly aware that when a person says, teach me all of Judaism standing on one foot, that's disrespectful, and that should be criticized. But what did Hillel do? The word Hillel comes from a word which means light, like in the English word halo. Hillel is related to light. What does light do? Light is able to find things that are not revealed. Hillel was able to look into the motives of the person and say, you know what? The person's disrespectful attitude, that's a veneer. That's not what's really going on deep down. Deep down, this person really wants to learn about Judaism. This person is really sincere. Hillel is able to not only accept the person, but even accept the person's mistakes. That sometimes, not all times, but sometimes when someone says something that's wrong, you can sometimes recognize that they meant to say something positive, but it just came out because of the lack of knowledge. It came out in a negative way. So the difference between Hillel and Shammai is they both agreed that you don't water down Judaism. You don't allow Judaism to be denigrated. They both agree that you have to greet everyone and accept everyone, regardless of their flaws and foibles. The only difference is that Shammai did not look into the behavior to find something deeper. Shammai looked at the surface, and Hillel, whose name means light, to illuminate, was able to probe beneath the surface and find that this person's behavior, though it was wanting on the surface, but beneath the surface there was something very spiritual. I just want to conclude, there were three great Hasidic masters. My son, Rabbi Yeshua, reminded me before the class. the three great Hasidic masters that all were known for their obsession with Ahavat Yisrael, love of Israel, love of one another. But they had subtle differences between them. One of them was Reb Zusha. Reb Zusha, when he saw a person, he only saw the good. He couldn't see anything negative. It's the famous story of Zusha when someone asked him, how could you accept suffering with joy, even though he was very poor and not well physically and his family was impoverished. He said, I don't know why you're asking me the question. I never suffered in my life. He never saw negative. He only saw positive. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev saw the negative, but he was able to find some justification for it. He was like a defense lawyer, a good defense lawyer. The famous story of when he notices a Jew smoking a cigar outside the synagogue on Yom Kippur, and he goes over to him and he says, you probably forgot it was Yom Kippur. He says, no, I know it is. You probably forgot that it's forbidden to smoke on Yom Kippur. No, I know it's forbidden. The doctor probably told you have to smoke for your health. He says, no, I'm healthy. I'm doing it not because of health. And Rabbi Levi Yitzchak turns to God and says, look how wonderful your children are. Even when they sin, they don't lie. So he was able to take the negatives and see the positive in the negative. The Alter Rebbe, Reb Shneir Zalman, they were all colleagues. They were all very close to each other. Reb Shneir Zalman, even when he couldn't justify what the person did, he still embraced them totally. Even the person who did something wrong, can't be justified, can't be defended, he still embraced them with love. It didn't detract from the love. Rabbi Zusha didn't see the negative. Rabbi Levi Yitzchak found some extenuating circumstances. Those are three very, very high levels. And to the extent that we can incorporate some of these levels in our own lives, that would bring about a revolution in the Jewish world and will bring us to the ultimate redemption, at which time there will be total unity, unity within the Jewish community and unity within the whole world. As we say in our prayers, Bayom Hahu Yeh Hashem Echad U'Shmo Echad, then God will be one and His name will be one. When God's unity permeates the world, there will be unity amongst humanity as well. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask. Yes?
I think you should mention the place of converts in this.
The place of converts?
In your system, you always talk about the sentence of Avram.
Okay, I mentioned this last night at another talk, that Maimonides got a letter from a convert known as Avadia, who was taunted by fellow Jews that he is not a real Jew because he's not a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he has no right to mention the patriarchs in his prayers that our fathers. And Maimonides says that he could say that because he is all converts are descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in a spiritual vein. And then he concludes that while we, born Jews, trace ourselves to God through our patriarchs, you have a direct connection between God who created the world. So the convert is certainly embraced by Judaism. In fact, in the Torah, there's a commandment to love your fellow as yourself. There's an additional commandment to love the convert as yourself, which means that there's a greater obligation of loving the convert than there is of loving someone who was born Jewish. In other words, to emphasize the love is a much more a greater imperative than it is for everyone else. Any other questions? No questions? Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
Hey, I thought I enjoyed your speech. Thank you, your lecture. Thank you. And I was wondering about that Shammai and Hillel story because in both situations the end outcome is the same. That the student is sent away. You know, like Shammai sent the student away and Hillel sent the student away.
Hillel told him to brush up on his Judaism.
How he sent people away, or I mean, their answer was the same. It seemed.
No. Hillel didn't send them away.
Oh.
In the sense that he rejected him. He said, you want to know that all of Judaism, this is what a Judaism revolves around. Everything else is commentary. Now we go out and learn the rest.
Yeah.
In other words, I'm not telling you that Judaism is just one sentence,
Okay.
but that one sentence encapsulates all of Judaism.
Okay.
So you have that answer to your question, but meanwhile you have to, if you're really serious about it, you have to go out and learn.
Fair enough.
Yeah. And he came back later and he converted him.
Okay.
Yes?
The willows are like Amaharites.
The willows are worse than well, it depends how you translate Am Haaretz. Am Haaretz is usually referring to an ignoramus. But Am Haaretz also means a uncouth person, someone who has no sophistication in any way. Sometimes someone could be an ignorant in Torah, but he could be a brilliant person in other areas, or a very good person. Am Haaretz is someone who's very, very earthy, just only has materialistic interests. That's one of the interpretations of Am Haaretz. So that's what the willows could be a symbolic of. Yes. Sometimes the way the willow is described in Hasidic literature as being the simple Jew. The simple Jew who has no sophistication, but the Baal Shem Tov loved the simple Jews more than he loved the scholars, because he felt that the simple Jew is sincere, has no airs about him, and captures the essence of God more than anyone else. So this poor willow, while it's the lowest level, is really in a certain way the highest level.